Hi there my friends, welcome to my YouTube channel. 2 weeks ago Derwent sent me 100 tin of the Inktense pencils. I already had the 72 set, but they sent me the 100 set as a gift as they'd just released 28 new colours. So when I opened them up I swatched out the 28 new colours. You can see those ones at the bottom of the swatch sheet. And then I tried to decide what I was going to create with them, just using those 28 colours. And I decided on a little red-eyed tree frog. As you can see, I've popped the finished painting to the left-hand side of the picture. Now this video nearly didn't happen because when I started editing the footage, I'd forgotten to tie my hair back, and so my hair kept wisping in and out of frame. So if you see a few wisps coming in from the bottom left hand side, that's why I've put the frog painting there finished instead of the top corner. Okay, so I'm using the paper I'm working with is Archie's Cold Press watercolour paper. It's in a block form, and it's just 10 centimetres by 25 centimetres. And for those of you that still work in inches like me, it's 3.9 inches by 9.8. Now the palette I'm using is by Caran d'Ache, and it's just a textured surface palette. You can make one of these yourself, get an old plastic palette, sand it with a piece of sandpaper to roughen up the surface, and then a little grab the pigment from your pencils. So this is how I'm going to predominantly be using these 28 pencils during this project. So I decided in a little sketchbook, made some notes, deciding on what colours I wanted to use and where on this painting. It's nothing like the photograph that I was working from. So I decided to start off with the background, and this part of the filming went okay. Okay, so I've just scribbled out 2 of the pencils onto the palette. You don't need to apply any pressure. The palette will just take the pigment because it's got that rough surface. Added some water. I do work with deionized water when I'm working water-soluble mediums, just to protect the mediums in the future. Added water to the area and then started working wet in wet. Really simple technique. Beginners can do this technique. It's there's nothing in this project at all that wouldn't be suitable for a beginner to use in their projects if they want to create with Inktense pencils. Now the reason Derwent sent me this set, as I said, they've released these 28 new colours, and the reason they gifted me a brand new 100 tin is because I'm a Derwent ambassador. I was asked August last year, I believe, and I jumped at the chance to work with more of their products, and they're a fantastic company to work with. They care about their art products, they care about the artists they work with and for. They love feedback, excuse me, positive and negative. Not that there's many negatives at all. And yeah, great company, great products. Okay, so I'm working with a filbert brush here. That's a flat brush with a rounded end, so it's no harsh lines, hopefully. Popping down some water so I can work wet into wet again. Now this video was running at about 3 hours when I started editing, but because of all the clipping out and cutting and snipping and swiping and everything else you have to do in the video editing world, it's down to about 22 minutes. So there's plenty to see, but obviously there are some bits where I've had to cut. So just working with these 2 colours and working in very gently with the brush, so no pressure at all being added to the paper with the brush. Nice and gentle, keeping the brush clean in between colour changes, and then obviously mixing the 2 colours together to form different hues and tones and colours. Really is a lovely medium to work with. Now these Inktense pencils, if you're not familiar with the name Inktense, it's the Derwent range, and they've created Inktense pencils, Inktense blocks and Inktense pans. Okay, so there's the top, the middle and the bottom finished. all work the same way. Now I did dry each layer with a hairdryer, and then I added 2 more layers to the background. So the background's made up of 2 substantial layers in the finished project, and 1 just where I went in and just did a little bit here and there where I felt it needed it, just to get that intensity. When Inktense dries, it's pretty much permanent, so you can work on canvases, materials, wood, paper obviously, and it is permanent when dry, which makes it great for glazing, but a little bit more difficult if you like lifting paint back off, because obviously it will be permanent, the layers will be permanent underneath. So now going on to the bottom petal of this flower, applying some water there just so we can work wet into wet again, because at this stage I don't want any strong lines showing up. Now if I worked wet onto dry, there'd be a chance that the paper would just simply absorb the pigment, and then I wouldn't be able to get any soft layering and things like that, and soft blending. So it is important, if you want to work in a softer style to begin with, it's easier just to work wet into wet. This paper is very forgiving, especially at this size. Like I said, it's a block, which means it's been gummed. The pages are gummed together round all 4 sides. Then there's a little notch, a little opening running down one of the sides, in the middle, but down one of the sides, and you simply insert a palette knife once your painting is dry, and you just edge round all the way round the gummed areas just to release the block. So that was layer 1. As I said, the background was made up of 2 full layers and a very light layer, very light third layer. The petals are made up of around about 3 layers as well, and I thoroughly dry the layers with the hairdryer in between. So it's really simple. Brilliant materials to work with. If you haven't given them a go, they're all open stock. So the pencils, the blocks and the pans are all open stock, so you could just get a handful of colours. If you're into botanicals, they do some fantastic pinks and purples and magentas and things, as you can see that I've scribbled onto the palette there. And going on with the second layer. And as you can see, the first layer is not lifting at all. So it's lovely if you like building up glazes. It's a wonderful pigment to work with, wonderful material to work with, I should say. So yeah, going through this footage was just heartbreaking because there was so much I'd got to cut out, but you do get the gist of exactly how I worked it all with the footage that I've got left in. And if you do find you see a few hairs flicking backwards and forwards, I hope you don't find it too distracting. There's my head just poking in there, the glasses. Oh my word. Oh dear, sorry about that. I'm going to find 22 minutes of apologising. Now, keeping the surface wet. So I haven't dried this one out, this layer that I've just finished, and I'm able to, as long as I'm quick, is to keep on adding further pigment and just letting it bleed in. When I'm working on something like a petal or a leaf, or even fur for that matter, I always go in the right direction. So if you do feel like you're leaving any lines underneath that you've not been able to take out, at least they'll be going in the correct direction, so they shouldn't be too noticeable on the finished product. Drying it again with a hairdryer. So with Inktense, I like to build up in lots and lots of light layers, and that way you can really build the intensity of the colour, because that is one of the major selling points for these materials, the Inktense, is that the colours really pop. And any dry mediums, water mixable dry mediums, I always swatch them out because they never look the same when they're dry as when they're wet. And it's not until you wet them and see them in actual swatch form that you realise just how vibrant the colours are in Inktense. So going on again. So now this is building up the third layer on this petal and just increasing that depth of colour. And obviously the more layers you get, because it's a translucent material, very few of them are opaque. Well, they've got a tiny bit of opacity, but not an awful lot. So the more layers you can build up, the better, because the light will enter through the top layers and it will just start jumping about, bouncing about on the layers underneath, and it will give your project a lot more depth. I think that's called refraction, although don't count me on it. Light refracting and bouncing around in the layers, that sounds right. So building up again and keeping this nice and quick, working it quick, because obviously like watercolours and like normal inks, they do dry relatively quickly through absorption and the water evaporating into the air. So onto the second petal. And obviously with this medium, as with all of the projects that I work on in all different mediums, I do go backwards and forwards between different areas on a painting, to keep the painting balanced, and you can do this. I like to work light to dark with Inktense, but you can work dark to light, although it is somewhat more limited than working light to dark. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking of having a play with Inktense too. But it's all about layering. For me, in most mediums, because I'm self-taught, it's nearly always about building up the layers, concentrating on contrast more so than colour, and getting your darks dark enough and your lights light enough just to create a bit of a pop when you look at it. And obviously creating contrast doesn't mean just black and white. It's to do with the lighter tones versus the darker tones in a painting. If you're having problems deciphering whether a colour has a darker tone or a lighter tone than another colour, then either take a photograph of your artwork and turn it into black and white. I think most of us now do have mobile phones where you can do that by just decreasing the colour saturation, and that will show you the image in black and white. So you can do that with your reference image, you can do that with your project as you're painting as well, just to make sure you're getting your contrast correct within a painting. That's if it matters to you. If you just want to sit and have a play, you sit and have a play. Art is for enjoying, and don't let anything that I say or anybody else say take that away from you. If you like to create, then that's the main thing. So glazing over again. I think out of the 28 colours, I used around about 24 of them, 23 or 24 of them in this. I didn't have to, it's just that I just wanted to push the colours a little bit further just to see exactly what what they could do. Stumbling over my words now, and I have got a coffee. I'm trying to think what I'd be like if I didn't have a coffee, half asleep. Back in with the filbert brush. And then this brush here that I'm using is by Rosemary & Co. It's a British company, and this particular brush is my favourite, and it's a series 344 and it's a number 6. So with Inktense you can use your watercolour brushes or acrylic brushes. Either way it's going to work, and because putting the dry pigment onto the palette first, or you can be lifting it off with the wet brush off the tip of the pencil if you just need a tiny little bit of pigment. It doesn't damage your brushes at all. Even going over the rougher surface of that palette doesn't damage your brushes. And what I don't suggest though, and I have seen people do it with watercolour pencils, so I don't suggest it with any pencils at all, is dipping them in a jar of water to activate the pigment. Don't do that, because if the water seeps up and into the wooden casing surrounding the pigment is likely to split, and also you don't want your pigment inside the pencil remaining damp for any length of time. So if you do want to take pigment straight from a pencil, just wet your brush and then just delicately wipe your brush across the pencil tip. Okay, so working wet into wet again, working in the base coat first and working light to dark. That's all I'm doing, and then you can go backwards and forwards, light to dark, dark to light, and just build those layers up. And the more layers you put on with this with the Inktense, the more it starts to behave more like a gouache. It's still permanent, but the opacity, you can play around with that as well, and especially by mixing some of the opaque colours, the more opaque colours, sorry, with the more translucent colours, you can vary the opacity and translucency as well without losing the vibrancy of the pigment. None of the Inktense colours in the pencil range are as opaque as something like gouache. They've all got that translucency, obviously, because they want to let the light of the paper shine through. But some colours do have a little bit of a more opaque tendency, I guess you could say. So in the swatches, where if you have a look at the swatch sheet right at the beginning of the video, you can see that I've done little squares, and you put the pure pigment at the top of the little square and then drag it down with a damp brush, and then it gives you a range of hues, I guess, well, a range of opacity. I also put a black line across each box, and by the way that colour dries on top of that black line will show you how translucent or how opaque a colour is. I can't get my words out, sorry. So yeah, all the footage excuse me, of doing the frog's body was lost, I'm afraid, but it was just done exactly the same as I did the flower petals, just building up very gradually in layers. That's all it is, just really thin, translucent layers. Excuse me. I'm working wet into wet for the eyes. There are other videos on my YouTube channel that show me working in Inktense, so if this isn't hitting the mark for you, then because of the footage that's had to be cut out, then please feel free to go and have a look. There's a Betta Fish, which is your Siamese fighting fish in Inktense. That's a full video. There's a green iguana in Inktense. That's a full video as well, and they're on my YouTube channel. So just dropping a little bit more in. I was so close to the painting and I kept looking up at the monitor to make sure my head wasn't getting in frame. And of course, duh, when I look up, of course my head's not in the frame because I've just moved to look up. Oh, crumbs. Why do I do it? So next project, the camera is going to be situated where if I get in the way, I'm going to actually be hitting my head. So that's... I'm going to take a massive step and move my camera right the way down so my head can't get in the way anymore, and I need to tie my hair back for every video. Oh, I might have to leave myself a post-it note to remind myself, because I was so disheartened when I started editing this video footage. Never mind. We live and learn, don't we? Well, I hope we learn anyway. So just dropping in a little bit more of the red there. What you can do is, if I were to do this painting again, and that's it, we live and learn, I think I would have masked out some of the highlights. So the lightest parts on the frog, I think I would have popped in a little bit of masking fluid, worked around it, dried it off, and then taken the masking fluid off and then popped in very light wash. What I ended up doing with this is, because there wasn't a white in with the new 28 colours, obviously there's a white in the 100 set, but I didn't want to pull that out. I just wanted to stick with the new 28 colours. is I got a little bit of white gouache, and just speckled a little bit here and there, and then because it's gouache, it's a water-based medium as well, which is the same as Inktense, and then got a little bit of translucent colour and just started blending the two together just to bring the highlights back out. Because as I said, it's really hard to lift because it's permanent, and that is one of its properties, and that's one of the properties I love about it, because you can endlessly glaze without the fear of the colours underneath lifting. And obviously with gouache as well, you can, if you don't like where you've put it, you can simply lift it off and start again because the layers underneath are permanent. So just blending that round again. So just lessening the effect of the gouache for now. And then I'll dry it off with the hairdryer, and I can I can go over it if I don't like it, or I can lift it off if I don't like it. You can glaze over it. Gouache does have a tendency of lifting easily, but if you're very light-handed, you can actually glaze over it and just tint it. Hi there my friends, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm working Derwent Inktense on a piece of cold press watercolour paper. It's 140 pounds in weight. I haven't pre-stretched it, I've just taped it down to a board, popped a little sketch on there, and off we go. So at the moment I'm working with the Inktense pans. Derwent did send me these pans to have a play with and maybe do a review later on, so I didn't pay for these or the Inktense pencils that you'll see later on in the video. I am a Derwent ambassador, so they do send me products as they arrive. Okay, so in each little area at the moment I'm adding water, and then I'm just dropping in some pigment, so that's the wet in wet technique. The best thing about the Inktense products is that they are permanent when dry. It does mean that they're a little harder to lift. If you put something down and you don't want it to be there, you've pretty much got to go in straight the way and lift it back out, because once it's dry it's there for good. But on the plus side, that does mean you can layer and layer and layer, lots of layers, lots of glazing can be used, glazing techniques where you're tinting the colour below. So they really are fun to work with, and it's a nice fast medium to work with too. I could have done this painted just as easily with watercolour, because the same techniques and the same methods do apply to both. And as you can see, I've popped the finished painting up in the top left hand corner there for you to see where I was aiming for. I had a reference image for the robin, and that's about it really. So making it up as I was going along, which is fun. This was just a fun piece. I just sat down, just wanted to play, wanted to relax. I'm sure you all know what that feels like when you get your art products out, and no pressure, just put a podcast on, or YouTube, or the radio or something like that, or some music in the background, and just have a play. It's so relaxing. So there you go, building up the pigment. So just using limited colour palette at the moment for the background, because I want this to be all about the bird and obviously the lantern, and less about the background. Just to let you know that as you can see me go through the background, creating a background, I dried it off with a hairdryer, and then I did it 2 more times. So the background was put in 3 times in all. I haven't shown all of that in this video because it's just a rinse and repeat. It's just the same thing, and it's just to build up that intensity. Sorry, but I'm going behind the reference image there, but it's just the same. Adding water first, then adding pigment on top, dropping the pigment in and letting the pigment just do its own thing, pretty much how you would if you were using watercolours. So these Inktense pans and pencils that you'll see later on, they are light fast in their dry form, but once you add water, the light fast, it's a bit iffy then. There probably are light fast, but I wouldn't go as far to say I'm definitely sure that they are, because as far as I'm aware, Derwent have the same sort of thought ideas as well. You know, who knows how much water someone's going to add to these pigments, and that might alter how light fast they're going to be in years to come. But I must admit, the paintings that I have done with the Inktense, and they're hanging in the house and they've been sold to clients who have kept me informed, none of them have faded. So not sure. So keep an open mind about the light fastness of the Inktense pigments once water's added. But they are matte when they dry, which is great if you want to photograph your work and then make prints or cards and things like that. So you could make your money back by producing things like that if you don't want to sell your original artworks because of the light fast issues. Well, I shouldn't say issues, but the light fast question mark. Okay, so moving on, I want to keep it quite light around the lantern itself. So I'm making the washes lighter in tone, so more water, less pigment. Just going quite steadily around the bird and around the lamp, because as I said, if you get this pigment anywhere, it's pretty much there to stay. And the last thing I want are purples going across anything where I don't want them to be. I hope everyone's keeping well. It's just a week till Christmas now, Christmas 2023. I hope everybody's gearing up for a relaxing, festive time. If you celebrate Christmas, I hope you're getting some time off work and are able to see family and friends. And keep safe, everybody. And I hope you all have a wonderful time. And I hope I've timed this right, so it might give you an idea of painting a little Christmas card for somebody or something like that. You've still got time, you've got a week, there's always time for art. So just playing with those pigments there, and there you can see I've added one whole background coat. Now I'm just going in, adding water to the side of the lamp, adding a little bit of yellow, keeping in mind where because the light is going to be coming from that lamp and I don't want to get too dark. And there you go. So that was 3 layers. So that background was completed in three layers. And if you can see to the left hand side of the lamp, there is a little bit of a hard line there. When you're working with Inktense, hard line between the yellow and the purple above it, a little bit of a hard line. When you're working with Inktense, excuse me, because it is a stain, they are staining colours, they stain your paper, that's why they won't lift. Hard lines, you've got to work quick to avoid. Okay, so you've got to work quickly to avoid hard lines, and I didn't quite catch that area quick enough, but it's fine. It all sort of blends in and looks okay in the finished painting. And this was just a play piece, and I just happened to have the camcorder running, so hey ho, nothing lost there. And I could have gone on with more layers of yellows using the stronger pigments and covered up that hard line, but to be quite honest, you know, it's a little tiny painting, just a play piece, experimental piece, I guess. And I'm happy with the outcome, so that's all that matters. So using 3 of the Inktense pencils now and working wet into wet. Just adding a bit of pigment, just want to get that white paper covered up to begin with in the initial layers. Going in with I think that's a number 6 Rosemary and Co brush. One of my favourite watercolour brushes, the Rosemary and Co. And this is, I can't remember which series it is, I'll pop it in the description below, but it's my favourite watercolour brush. Comes out for gouache, comes out for watercolour, and obviously comes out for Inktense. You can use all of your watercolour brushes for Inktense, but if you've got brushes that are, say, a white bristle, and you want to keep them looking pristine, don't use them with Inktense, because the Inktense will stain the hairs and bristles of your brushes. Just a little warning then if you're precious about your pristine looking brushes, which I'm not. They're there to do a job, they're a tool. Okay, and as you'll see during the painting, I move that board around constantly. For those who've known me for a long time, you'll know that I had rotator cuff muscle problems in my shoulder, and so I make life easy for myself now, and I rotate my work as needed, so I'm always in a comfortable position. I'm actually working flat doing this painting. I do lift the board up at an angle later on in the painting when I'm working on the robin, you'll see that. That's just to make sure the paint is moving in the direction I want it to move, but for the most part for this piece I just work flat. Other times I'll be working standing up at an easel, so it's either one or the other, but for this I needed the washes to go on flat, so I wanted the board flat. Simple as that. So as you can see, you need, with the pencils, you need such a tiny amount of pigment scribbling off onto something rough. This is a textured palette by Caran d'Ache, and it's because of the texture of it, it's ideal for scribbling on some pigment and then adding water and lifting it off with a brush. Or you could get a normal plastic palette and go over it with a piece of rough sandpaper, rinse it off under the tap, and then you'll have that rough texture on a piece of plastic to do the same technique as this. But if you do make any rough marks on a plastic palette, just be aware that it will stain from there on. The colours will penetrate the plastic and stain it, but that doesn't worry me either. Oh, look at my weird reflection in the metal part. Ooh, it's like one of those magic mirrors at the fair. Okay, so moving on, adding a little bit of yellow. Nice light washes now. So anywhere where I want the light to be radiating from that lantern, I need to go on very lightly with the colours. So I go on with a little bit of yellow, and while it's still wet, dab off in the middle. That's what I did with the two metal bits running down the front of the lantern. I went over them with a very light wash and then lifted off some of the pigment with a tissue, just retaining that luminosity right in the middle of the lantern itself. Now I've used a couple of other pencils, an orange and a darker yellow, doing exactly the same thing, but now I'll keep that pigment just to the top and bottom of the lantern window. So top, bottom, add a little bit of water. Oh, now I'm going in with a little bit more pigment. A little bit more pigment, but I don't want it right in that middle, so straight in with the tissue, and there you go. And then rinse and repeat in the other two little windows, and just keep dabbing the middle section just to maintain the lighter pigment in the middle. There you go. It's really, really simple. And when I started this painting, I didn't know how I was going to approach the lantern. So it's just something, one of those things you figure out as you go along. And every painting is different. I've been painting since I was sort of 4, and I'm 57 now. And it's a continuous learning curve. And that's what makes it fun. So leaving the lantern alone for now, letting all of that. Oh no, I'm going in with the darks. I thought I was going into the robin then. Oh. Okay, so adding the same again. So this is the same technique I used to apply the yellow. Just going in with a little bit of pigment. I'm assuming I'll go top and bottom, and then lifting it out in the middle if it goes too far down. And by using quite a bit of water, they're lifting the board there so that the pigments flow in the correct direction. So it is quite controllable. As I said, you could do exactly the same thing just using watercolour. And what you're not seeing is between each layer, I am drying this off completely with a hairdryer, just to make sure that when I go on top with anything else, everything underneath is dry. So just drag that orange pigment down over the two metal pieces of the lantern, just to create a warmth in the metal. It's really simple. and always keeping a piece of tissue in one hand when I'm working with watercolours or Inktense or even acrylics. There you go. And that's why. Okay, so we're going over to the fir tree, the spruce. I'm assuming it's some species of spruce, and going in just with the dark branches, keeping everything light, because I can always go darker. It's a little bit more trickier to go lighter though with Inktense, unless you want to start going into mixed media, like you could add gouache on top of this, or you could add coloured pencil on top of this, but keeping everything light layers and building up. And then if you do make a mistake and you've only gone in lightly, it would be easier to disguise. The snow falling that you can see on the finished painting, that was just done right at the end, which you'll see, that is in the video, and that's just the splatter technique using a little bit of white gouache and drying off with a hairdryer as well, and it works really well with the Inktense as an underpainting. But as I said, all of this could have been achieved just as easily with watercolour. So got some of the branches in. I'd obviously got fed up of doing the branches, so I do flip from part to part when I'm painting. I don't stick in one corner and then work my way methodically across a painting. I like it to be an enjoyable activity. It's my job after all, and I'm doing it a lot of the time. I want to be comfortable, I want to be making the most of my time, and I want it to be enjoyable. So I decided to go over and start on some of the fir tree needles, and it's just a case, all I did, had in mind that I would put a lighter colour down, so a lighter green down, and then I'd build up glazes over the top of this to create shadows on the fir tree. And as you're putting glazes on to create shadows, you're also enhancing the colours, the amount of colours where you've already put your initial green. So this is just a guideline really, and everything else will be worked on top of this. Where I want the snow to be really white, I'm actually not going to be applying any paint to that. I'm going to be very careful that I retain the white of the paper. Now you could mask it out, but I mean it's time consuming, and really for this a piece this size, it's really easy to just work around the areas where you don't want any paint. So carrying on, just popping that in with the Rosemary & Co. number 6. Lovely little paintbrush. Got a couple of these ones and they keep their tips so fine. I've got another one, but I've never had to use it, and I've had this brush must be going on for about 6 years, I guess, 6 or 7 years, and I've got the other one just as a backup, just in case. But as I said, not needed to use it yet. I have a little pot near my painting area with all my brushes in, watercolour brushes that I use most often, and then I have a display set at the back of me with other watercolour brushes that I reach for rarely. So I am going to do a studio tour. Now I'm in the new studio and people have been requesting that, so that will be coming hopefully first couple of weeks of the new year, hopefully. And then I'll show you what I have in my studio, how I store things. Yeah, a little nosy round. Just going in, making sure that the needles are, these little leaves are pointing in the right direction for each branch. If you're working off a reference image for this, I wouldn't suggest going needle for needle, as long as everything's moving in the right direction. You're never going to have your reference image hanging next to your painting, so just keep that in mind. Excuse me. Yeah, I could have edited all of this out, showed you a little bit, but it gives you a rough idea of how I approach things, and leaving gaps. So not doing all of the needles connected to a main stem. I am doing some where they seem to be floating in space, and that is because they're going to be surrounded by snow. So it's just the tip of the leaf poking through. Now I've mixed up a lighter wash, which is, I'm classing it as a glaze because I'm now going over the colours, and it's just tinting whatever is beneath it. So whether that's white paper, it's tinting it. Whether that's the green foliage I've already applied, it's tinting that. And with the foliage, because I've left gaps between the little needles, whatever colour I put on top is going to be tinting the paper between the needles and tinting the needles. So straight away you're getting differences in colour and differences in value. And value is just how light or dark something is, that's all. So going in with a darker value there, because that's going to be in shade. You can see that in the finished painting. That is the robin's creating a little shadow there on that one. And going in even darker. So just keep building this up. This is all going wet into wet. So I pre-wet the area first with clean water. Make sure your brush is clean, and then just adding the pigments as I go along. And at this point you could add more leaves. You could even, go in with your pencils then once it's dry. You could go in with coloured pencils. You can go on top of this with gouache, anything like that. So wetted the area first, going in with some browns. And this is still the pencils. The rest of the painting, apart from the speckly snow at the end, is just the Inktense pencils. So wetting the area again. Now got to keep in mind that I want the light of the lantern to be hitting that side of the robin, so making sure I'm going in with light colours and hues there, and going into the reds and the darks towards the left of the bird where it would be more shadowed areas. That's wet on dry now, pulling the pigment down towards the edge of those feathers there, just there, wet onto dry. So I haven't pre-wet that area else it would just blend straight out. It would feather out. No pun intended with the words feather out. A little bit of shadowing round the back of the head. Again, just keeping my mind where the light is. And I had my head over. I had to get, because it's such a small painting, I had to get right over the top of the painting to apply the eye. But I just went in with blue and very dark brown and left some area for the highlight. So it was nice and easy. Going on with darker tones now. Working wet in wet. That's the lovely thing about Inktense, is you can go wet on wet over a dried area with no fear of anything lifting back up, which isn't the case always with watercolours. Sorry about that. Going in darker, you can really build the intensity up on. These pigments look very, very dull when they're dry. So if you look at the pans or look at the pencils, they all look quite dull. But you add water to them and they are so vibrant. So all of my water-soluble mediums, I always swatch them out because they look so different wet to when they're dry. So I've got a swatch sheet in front of me and I look at that before choosing my colours. Some of the colours I know because I've used them often, but if it's a colour I'm wanting to mix and I'm not quite sure because I haven't used it before, I'll look at my swatch sheet. And the pans, the Inktense pans, the Inktense blocks and the Inktense pencils are all interchangeable. They're all the same pigment but in a different format, so that you can mix and match them. They're all open stock, which means you can buy them all open, one pencil or one pan or one block. They are a dream to work with. And you can work them on fabrics as well as paper and card. You could work them on cardstock, Bristol board, anything like that. But they really come into their own on watercolour paper. Beautiful. I'm yet to try them on canvas, so that's on my to-do list for the new year. Okay, just drying everything off, making sure it's really bone dry before going on with my next layers. Doesn't take long, just a couple of minutes to dry. And then just adding water there so I can start adding shadows. Using purples, lilacs for the shadows. I'd never suggest using black. Black's very flat, even if you mix it with something else, which I do suggest if you're using it in other parts of your painting, to never use it on its own. But I never use black in a shadowed area. It can look very, very dull and odd. And if you're using black and it happens to butt up to anything yellow, you're very likely to get a dirty green colour, and that's not very nice in any painting at all. So just going on with different pigments, using some yellow so that the feathers are reflecting light from the lamp, and lilacs and purples. And once this layer was dry, I went over it again. I think there was possibly 2 or 3 layers for this part of the body of the bird. Just darkening everything off. Keeping it simple. It's just lovely, isn't it, watching the paint do its own thing in a wetted area. I'm that relaxed, I'd even got my elbow leaning on the table to the left. Oh, it's just such a relaxing painting to do. I really enjoyed this one. I don't know if you can see that. I've left a very thin white line running down the right hand side of the bird, and leaving that little bit of paper just peeking through just adds to the feeling of the light hitting the bird. You know, I could have gone in at the end and added that with gouache or a white pencil. I know some people like to use white gel pens, but I'm not that keen on those. I'd rather use paint if possible. Just darkening everything up, creating more shadows. These are the final touches now. You know, you keep standing back. If you're unsure, go away, let your painting dry naturally, make a tea or a coffee or something, and then come back to it with fresh eyes, even if that's the next day, and have a look and see what your painting needs. Now, I've used a little bit of transparent paper to mask out the bird so it's not stuck on the bird. I've just cut round, laid it very gently on top of the bird before I apply some background speckles with a toothbrush. That's watered down gouache in that little pot. Then once I've got enough in the background and I want bigger spots, I go on with a brush, because I need some of that snow falling in front of the robin. That's why I've now removed the little piece of masking. And if any of those little droplets hit anywhere where I didn't want them, I could quickly go in with a tissue and lift them up, because the pigment underneath is permanent. So just steadying my arm there on my hand so I don't have to move the board around, and just enhancing some of the snowy parts, and that's it, it's done. So I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I hope you all have a fantastic Christmas. Thank you for supporting me on YouTube this past year and all your lovely comments. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye. Hey there my friends, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today's project I'm going to be working in Inktense. It's a water soluble ink by Derwent, and it comes in 2 forms. Pencil form, I've got the 72 pencil set, and I also have a 36 cube set. It's like the sticks of compressed soluble ink. I do believe there's a 72 set in the sticks, but I've got the 36. When working with Inktense, I do suggest that if you're going to give them a go, that you do a swatch sheet. As you can see on the right, I've done one, because the colours are very different from dry to once you've added water. So first of all, I prepared a sketch on a separate piece of paper of the Betta fish that I was going to paint. I then transferred that to this watercolour paper block, and the watercolour paper here is Fabriano hot pressed traditional white at £140. It's 9 inches by 12 inches, 100% cotton, and it's in a block form. So I've just put a bit of acid free washi tape around the edges, just so I've got nice clean edges when that's removed at the end of the painting. So what I did to begin with, I got a dark violet pencil, Inktense pencil, and I coloured in the background. It took forever, so I didn't want to film all of that. You'd be bored stiff watching that. And then applied water, and it really does go, the changing colour is very different, so you do need to do a swatch for that. I did that background 3 times to get the density of colour that I actually required. So I know all these videos on YouTube are sped up. That really did take quite a while doing the background. So I had plenty of coffee and listened to some YouTube, I do believe. Okay, so to begin the Betta fish itself, I'm doing wet in wet. So I've used the Inktense sticks. I've made a wash. As you can see, I'm using a ceramic palette. You can get those on Amazon and from other art-based retailers. Added 4 drops of distilled water into each well. That's the deionized water that you use in car batteries, so it's nice and pure. And then brushed off with a wet paintbrush the pigment into each well, so I've got enough paint ready to be getting on with. Then to each part of the painting where I wanted to go in wet, I applied water first out of a clean jar of deionized water, and then dropped a few drops of the paint onto the water covered area. The thing is, when you're working wet in wet, it's timing really. There's wet paper when you've put the water on to begin with, and at the other end of the scale there's dry paper when it's completely dry. Then there's two parts in that system that play a part. So you've got wet paper where you've applied the water. Then as the water is evaporating or drying into the paper, you're left with a sheen on the paper. And then there's also nearly dry, so there's 4 different ways of working watercolour. The thing is to practice on another piece of paper, because all papers react differently, and obviously paints react differently too. Now the lovely thing about using these Inktense water soluble inks is that once they're dry, they're actually unsoluble. You can't re-wet them like you can watercolour. But as you see here, the paper looks dry, but in actual fact it's not. It's just hit that stage where it's not quite dry. So what I'm doing is I'm going in with my brush, which is the Clairefontaine series. So a 344, and it's a number 6. It's my favourite brush, the one I use all the time for all different water-based mediums. And what I'm doing, I'm wetting the brush, I'm running it gently over the area where I've applied the Inktense, and I'm lifting the pigment off, and this gives the appearance of texture. There's no texture there, obviously, the paper's still completely flat. And once I want to dry an area completely, I do set it with a hairdryer. So just run a hairdryer over it. You can use a heat tool, just don't have it on too high a setting, and that just fixes all of the Inktense into place, and then you can work layers on top without the fear of it lifting. So here, because the paper's not 100% dry, I am able to quickly go in with a damp brush and lift pigment off. Okay, so here I've zoomed in. don't know if this was fit. There's some footage later on in the video that I filmed with my iPhone, so you get nice close-ups as well of me working and not just working from a distance. Here you can see though that the pigment is lifting off. It's so you're never going to go back to the white of the paper 100% because the Inktense will be staining the paper as you work. But as you can see, if you work quickly enough, it can be lifted. And as you can see, to the left of the picture is the fin that I was working on before, so you can see where the ridges are, or not ridges as in texture, but ridges as in where the pigment has been lifted. And I can't praise that brush enough. It's my favourite brush. You'll hear me talk about it a lot in all of my videos where I'm working with a water-based medium, sort of watercolour pencils, watercolour paints and Inktense. So all I've done, working round the top fins, that's the dorsal fin, and now going on to the tail, excuse me, of this Betta Fish, is I've applied a light layer of wash, wet into wet, got it to do what I want it to do, lifted out the whites with a damp brush, so gone back to a near as, oh, I'm really waffling today, it's first thing in the morning, that's why. So I've gone in to the areas around the dorsal fin, now beginning on the tail, wet in wet technique. You wet your paper, you add your pigment, and then just before the paper dries, you lift the pigment back out with a damp brush. That's what I've done all the way around the dorsal fin and now working on the tail. Once that layer, that initial layer is dried, just like I said, go over it with a hairdryer so it's completely dry. Then the beauty of working with Derwent Inktense is you can then go on with another layer. You can then repeat the same procedure with a different colour, or with a darker blue or a lighter blue even, and start tinting the colour that you've already put down. This is something that you can do with watercolours, but you always run the risk that you're going to lift that initial layer of watercolour, whereas with the Derwent Inktense, once it's down and heat set, it's permanent. So working around, keep going. This is the first layer going on, don't forget, so I am keeping it fairly light because I'm going to be building up the layers. Some of the colours, if you do a swatch sheet for yourself, you will see that some of them are quite opaque, but 9 times out of 10 they're mostly translucent. Obviously when you're laying colours on top of each other or letting colours mix on an individual layer, remember that if you put a blue up next to a yellow, it will go to green. They will intermix and bleed into each other. The same going if you've got a blue undercoat and you've dried it, so you've dried your base coat completely with a hairdryer. If that's blue and you put yellow on top, you will get green because obviously they're semi-transparent. You will be able to see the colours through them, and in that way you will get a green if you layer yellow on top of blue or vice versa. So just keep that in mind. Obviously also when you're working wet into wet, if you put 2 complementary colours in, they'll cancel each other out and you'll either end up with a grey or a brown. So keep that in mind as well. A complementary colour is simply a colour that's opposite another colour on a colour wheel, such as blue is opposite orange, green is opposite red. They're complementary colours and cancel each other out. Okay, so I've turned my work upside down now, and I've finished doing all the layers with the sticks. So now I'm going on with the dry medium. It's still the Inktense, and this is the Inktense white. So this is finishing. Now when you're working like this, when you start to add that white, if that white doesn't seem bold enough, then you can mix up a mixture of the white stick, which I found was more opaque than the white pencil, but we'll come to that later in the video. As you can see, I've worked right the way around the fins. So I started at the bottom, the pectoral fin, and I've worked right the way around through the dorsal fin and the tail, all the way around. Lots and lots and lots of layers wet into wet, pulling out the whites and then adding another layer of a different colour, wet into wet, pulling out the white, etc., all the way round, and then adding the white highlights with the white Derwent Inktense pencil. Now onto the body. So just building up light washes. Because it is a permanent medium once it's heat dried, it's easy to go from light to dark, but it's quite hard to go from dark to light. As I said, the pigments are not overly opaque unless you mix white in with them, and then you'd lose that vibrancy. These are really, really vibrant colours, and the idea of working with Inktense for me is to utilise that vibrancy that I find it a little bit more difficult to get with watercolours. You can get it with watercolours, it's just a little bit more difficult, and we'll cover that in another project. So this image that I'm working with is copyrighted to me, obviously, because it's my piece of artwork and I will be selling it and making prints from it later on. But I want you to learn techniques that you can use in your own projects, and there's 2 websites on the internet that I do suggest taking a look at, and that's pixabay.com and unsplash.com. They've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copyright-free photographs that you can use for your own projects. So here we're using wet on dry, so I've heat dried the paper now, so all of those layers underneath are nice and dry, and I'm now using a damp brush to take pigment off the tips of some of the pencils. This is what the pencils are made for. It won't damage them in any way. I wouldn't dip them into water or anything like that because you don't want to get the wood wet. But just picking off some colour with a brush is an easy way of transferring a tiny amount of pigment at a time. So that, as I said, the paper's dry. You could also do this in areas, and I do, we'll show you in a minute, that I wet some areas with a tiny bit of water and then pick some pigment off. I think I'm applying just water there. So when you pick your pigment off your pencil and pop it onto that little wet area, damp area, the pigment will bleed out. There you go. Inktense doesn't move as readily when working wet into wet as watercolour does. It does prefer to sit still a little bit more. So that's something you might want to alter your working practices if you're used to working with watercolour and want to give Inktense a go. Well, you can tell I never script these, can't you? I don't think I'd have time. How some YouTubers make a script to work from and then read from the script. Right, okay, so we're just adding a little bit more pigment of orange. And you don't need the 72 pencil set or the 72 block set. I mean, it's wonderful if you can have them. It's always nice to have all the colours. But because they're so mixable, I've found that the 36 stick set has been an ample enough for me. I mean, the 72 set of pencils, I'm very lucky to have, I know, but you could get away with a lot less. If you're thinking, should you get just the pencils or just the sticks to begin with, I'd probably go with the sticks, because you can do a lot with the sticks that you couldn't necessarily do just with the pencils on their own, or if you could do it, it would take a lot longer. So if you're thinking of trying any of the Derwent Inktense but you don't know which ones to purchase, then either pick up a set of 36 or 72 blocks. Make sure you've got a decent brush, or just pick up a few, because they're sold open stock, so you can buy the individual colours. You don't have to buy a complete set if you just want to give them a try. This paper that I'm working on, I'm really impressed with this this block. I was applying a lot of water when I was working wet into wet. It didn't buckle at all. Now I know it is in a block, so it shouldn't buckle anyway, but some brands do, even if they're in a block. If you saw the Squirrel watercolour pencil Squirrel, that sheet I actually took out of the block because the one previous to that had buckled so much it affected the pages underneath it. But this block, I'll just tell you what it is again. It's the Fabriano hot pressed traditional white, £140, 100% cotton, 9" by 12 inches, and it is in a block, and I didn't have to take it out of the block. This is actually worked on the block. It didn't affect any of the pages underneath. Fantastic paper, really, really good. And it is the hot pressed, so it's a very smooth surface, and even though it's traditional white, it has got a sort of creamy tint to it. Brushes. People think to get the minutest of detail they need the minutest of brushes. I wouldn't go along that line if I were you, for the simple reason is, if you're watching me use this Rosemary & Co, it's a series 344 and it's a number 6. It's a long brush. The hairs are long. They are synthetic, so no animals have been harmed in the making of this brush. It's a vegan brush. But look at that point. They are phenomenal brushes. This brush I've had for about 3 years, 4 years. I use it all the time. It's never lost its point. It's a phenomenal brush. Can't praise it enough. The thing is, with a brush with longer hairs will retain more water, and so it will retain more pigment too. So when I'm dipping it into the liquid that's in the palette beside me, I dip it in once. It's going to last for ages. There's that much pigment and water wanting to come out, but because the point is very small, it's coming out just where I want it. So all the detailing I can get done with this number 6. Now if you try and use one of the zeros or double zeros or triple zeros, which are tiny brushes, the hairs are very short and there's very few of them. Yes, they might have a beautiful point on them, but the amount of pigment and water they can hold is so limited that you're forever having to dip backwards and forwards. So I recommend going for a bigger brush and mastering that one. Practice with it. Practice with a few brushes, see which brush you like the most. So here we can see I've finished off the eye. I carried on working with the wet medium and then finishing it off with the Inktense pencils, the Derwent Inktense pencils. Now I'm moving across these little scales. Now you don't have to put every scale into a fish. If you see a fish in an aquarium, you don't see a snapshot as in a photograph. When you're watching a fish, you don't see all the scales. So if you are going to do a fish or something brightly coloured to give the Inktense a try, you can be as free and easy as you want. You can paint it quite loosely, or you can come in quite tight and do detail. It's completely up to you. It's more about your contrast, obviously with the background on this piece so very dark, and it is a really deep violet. It's a beautiful colour. With the highlights on the fish, there's a lot of contrast in this piece and it's quite eye-catching. So keep the contrast cranked up, so your dark's really dark, and leave your lights till last. If you're using black or if you're using white, when you use black, I wouldn't use it on its own because it can look very flat. I do talk about this in other videos, so sorry if I'm covering things that you've already heard, but for some people this might be the first video of mine they've seen. So if you work with black, I always go in with I'm taking the water off the furrow, the metal part of the brush there, just so that doesn't dribble down into the bristles and make it so there's too much water there. That's what I was doing there. So yeah, working with black, if I want a painting to look cool, then I'll do undercoats of blues or lilacs and then pop the black on top of that. That cools the black down so it's not flat. If I want my painting to look warm, I do undercoats of browns, reddish browns, reds, magentas. Then when you put the black on top of that, it looks warm, doesn't look flat. That's something to keep in mind too. So here we have the fish. Now I've made up a big pot of white. So I got the white Derwent Inktense stick, added some water, about 10 drops out of a pipette, and then I just really loaded it up with the white Inktense block. So a nice thick creamy mixture, and the white block is more opaque than the white pencil. So I'd already been in with the pencil and gone over all the highlighted areas. I'd applied water, waited for it to dry, and then heat dried it so it wouldn't lift. And now I'm going on with the Inktense block, which is a lot more opaque and actually sits and dries quite nicely on top of everything else. If you've got any questions about the Derwent Inktense, just ask them in the comments below. I do go through all of the comments. But this is a lovely medium to work with, and I do know a few people have contacted me saying they've got the Inktense but they've not used them yet. I hope this has taken away some of the fear. I do thoroughly suggest, if you haven't used them yet, to do a swatch sheet. Just so you can see the difference between when they're dry to when they're wet. There is a huge shift in colour. They go a lot darker, a lot more vibrant. There's a lot of pigment in a very small amount of Inktense paint. So yeah, when you mix it up, you don't need very much at all. It does go a long way. It's just been a complete and utter dream to work with. It's a beautiful medium, and I'll be doing a lot more with it. So this piece was start to finish completely Derwent Inktense. Nothing else has been used on this at all. And I even used the Derwent Inktense white pencil to sign my name, so it is 100% Derwent Inktense, apart from the initial sketch, which was I used a mechanical pencil just to get the initial sketch down to begin with. So wiping the furrow again, that's the metal part. If you dip your brush into water and you get water onto that metal furrow, it will seep down into the brush itself, and sometimes that can overload the brush and you end up with a big splosh of water if your bristles can't hold that amount. So just be aware of, keep wiping the furrow in case you've got water on there. Just adding a little bit of water there to the white that I'd added, just to smooth it out. So I didn't want any hard stop and start lines, so I've just blended those out with water while the Inktense is still wet. And obviously if you put white on an area and you heat dry it and it's all set, and then you look at it and you don't like it, or you think you've overdone it, then don't forget you can glaze over that with one of the translucent colours. And there we have him, a Betta Fish in Inktense. Hey there my friends, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be exploring the wonderful world of Derwent Inktense. I've used these in a past video. If you'd like to take a look at that, that's Betta Fish with Inktense. Today this is going to be a green iguana from my own reference material. Okay, so if you haven't heard of Derwent Inktense before, it's a water soluble ink, and it comes in two formats, pencils and blocks. So the blocks look like pastel blocks, but they're just blocks of this water soluble Inktense, and they come in the pastel form, which you can see I'm using here, and they can be used in a wide variety of ways. The difference between using these and things such as watercolour is that watercolour can be lifted to a certain degree, and Inktense, once it's dry, it can't be lifted, it can't be reactivated. So I'm using today Fabriano hot pressed watercolour paper. It's £140 in weight, 9 inches by 12 inches, and it is 100% cotton. I'll be using the Derwent Inktense pencils and blocks for this this project that I'm doing now. It did take a little bit longer than I anticipated, and a few more things cropped up as well, so this is a little bit overdue of being posted, but I hope you enjoy it anyway. The paper's taped with an acid-free masking tape just to keep the edges clean, and the paper is actually on a block, so it's a block paper, which means the edges have been gummed down. They're actually gummed together, glued together, and then when you finish your painting you simply take a palette knife, slide it in between the layers and lift the sheet off. So it saves having to stretch paper. I'm also going to be using water. Obviously this is a water soluble medium. Now the water that I use when I'm using a water soluble medium is deionized, and it's the sort you can buy for car batteries, things like that. I just use a generic one. There's about £2.50 for a litre, so it's quite cheap, but that's what I use when I'm using my water soluble mediums. Now I'm just checking some notes to make sure we're not missing anything. Let's have a quick look. So I hope everyone's keeping well, and we're actually getting some sunshine here over in the UK now, which is lovely, absolutely great. So the brush I'm using is my favourite brush, and if you've watched any of my videos before you'll know that this is my one standalone always reach for brush when I'm working in water soluble mediums, and it's by a company called Rosemary and Co, and it's a series 344 and it's a number 6. It's a huge brush in the volume of hairs. It's synthetic, it's vegan. No animals were harmed in the making of this brush, thankfully. And because there's a lot of hairs there, it holds a lot of water and a lot of pigment, but it actually, as you can see, can retain a really, really fine point. So I can do washes with it, I can do detailed work with it. Works for everything. It's a really brilliant brush, and if you're going to buy one brush this year for water soluble mediums, I'd recommend that one, and I'll pop it in the description below. So back to this, and back to turning over pages and finding where I am with my notes. So all I've done is I've sketched the iguana out, as I said, from a reference images, and do have a video on how I sketch, a couple of videos, because I do work digitally as well, so I sketch traditionally and digitally. This one was sketched out traditionally. Then transferred the completed sketch over onto the watercolour paper using some trace down graphite paper. Once I'd done that, I masked out the image of the iguana and just airbrushed the background with some acrylic ink. So that was the background done and out the way, because the main focus in this project is the iguana itself. If you'd like me to do any videos on airbrushing, just pop your ideas in the comments below, and also if you'd like me to do any different subjects or mediums, just let me know in the comments below, that'd be great. This was actually two subscribers had mentioned that they'd like to see lizard scales being created. They didn't mention a medium, so I took it upon myself to decide which subject I was going to do. I'd looked through my references, came across a few of an iguana, compiled a few of the images together to create a nice pose, and that's why I'm doing this iguana. And the reason I chose the Inktense above other mediums, because the two subscribers hadn't specified a medium, they just specified a subject, is that I wanted it to be quite bright, vibrant, and the ink really gives you that vibrancy that I was after. Now obviously you can create the vibrancy with other mediums. Pastels, it can be vibrant. Watercolours, it can be vibrant if you work it in certain ways. Oil paints and acrylics can also be vibrant, but I just thought this subject, to keep it small, and I thought I was going to keep it quick, but it turned out not to be. I decided to work in the Inktense. Am I rambling today? Feel like I am. Oh, and I just dropped my notes on the floor, but hey ho. And I don't know why, but my computer is now making weird sounds, but we'll ignore that. So yeah, the sketch has been popped on the paper, masked out, background airbrushed in, and now I'm going in with some very, very light washes of Inktense. Now, to the right of my hand on the table that is just out of view, there's a palette, and it's a plastic palette. And what I did to that plastic palette is I got a piece of sandpaper. I rubbed over the plastic palette with the sandpaper to roughen the surface. That way I can run my pencils across the surface and it will leave pigment in the wells of the plastic palette. I then use an eyedropper, just drop a couple of drops of water into that, and then I've got a paint. So I can use my pencils that way, or I can wet my brush and lift the pigment straight off the pencil pigment itself. I'll be doing that also during the course of this project. Also, I have the blocks at hand, so I know I can turn to use those just like using a pan of watercolour. But obviously it dries and settles and then it's permanent. So all I'm after at the moment is to get some details in to start building up the form of the iguana. Now people say, is it okay to trace and things like that? And I say yes, if it gets you motivated and creating artworks, then by all means. But the thing is, there will come a time in your artistic life when tracing just isn't going to hack it. And as you'll see later in this project, the sketch I did, I just had preliminary lines, and they're the lines that I've transferred, but that's not going to be enough lines there for me to complete this project. So I do keep returning to picking up a normal mechanical pencil. I think it's a 0.5 HB, and sketching in more details. And this is where you can't rely on tracing things. I need to get details onto that painting without any tracing, just working directly from a digital image that's on my iPad in front of me. And that's where I really encourage people to practice. Start off with tracing by all means, but practice your freehand drawing as well, because there are going to come times in your life, in your artistic journey, when you're going to have to rely on your ability to draw. Okay, so with Inktense, as I said, you can lay down layer after layer after layer, because the initial layers you lay down, let them dry. I sometimes use a hairdryer, and you'll see that later in this project. But once they're dry, they're permanent. I mean, you could scrub at them, I guess, with something quite harsh, and it would lift a little bit of the colour, but the trouble is you'd be disturbing the surface of your paper as well, so that's not really what you want. The idea of working with Inktense as opposed to watercolour is the fact that they are permanent once they're down. Now the permanency can differ by the way you apply this medium. If I was to get a piece of paper and one of the Inktense pencils and just scribble over the paper in an area just with a pencil, then apply water to it, make a bit of a wash, and then dry it, either let it dry on its own or dry it with a hairdryer. Once it's completely dry, once the paper's gone back to cold and not being warm if you've heated it with a hairdryer, once you know the sheen has gone, it's completely dry, you can lift and move about a certain amount of that pigment. Now the reason is, when applying just the pencil on its own and then applying water to it, not all the pigment gets dissolved, which means there's still some active pigment laying around on the surface of that paper. Now you won't be able to see it and you won't know it's there until you add water. So just bear that in mind. But this way, working wet on wet, so in some areas I'm applying a tiny bit of water first and then putting a little bit of pigment, wet pigment in, and letting it spread. This way I know that when that is dry it's going to be permanent, for the simple reason is all of the pigments have already been activated. I hope that makes sense. If you've got any questions, just pop them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. So that's the way to avoid unactivated pigments, is to work wet on wet and wet on dry. It's just when you work dry on dry and then add the water that it seems to not activate all the pigment. But that might be something you're after. You might want, say, a background or something where there's a little bit of what looks like granulation, and that'd be quite effective with Inktense if you worked it, just scribbled on a piece of paper with a pencil and then activated it with water, then let that dry, then reactivated it with maybe another pigment. That'd be quite interesting to see what mixes you get, because it would be a surprise, because you wouldn't know what percentage of the pigment had been activated as opposed to not. Okay, I'm just making myself confused now, but I hope you get the gist of that. So all I'm doing now, I'm creating base layers. So all of the work that I'm doing now, that you see going on now, is just a base layer for what I want to go on top. Now, when you look at a reference image, or when I look at a reference image, I'm trying to see what's underneath of the colours that are laying on top. Now, there could be a tone running through. There's always a value running through the picture itself, but what's the tone, what's the hue, and it's the colour underneath everything else that I'm trying to get on to begin with. One, it gives me something, a starting point, because I don't think I know any artists who like staring at a blank piece of paper. It can be quite overwhelming, and every painting is completely different. When you start painting a new painting, sometimes it's as though I've never painted before. You know, it's getting over that first hurdle. That's why you see a lot of times where people work in oils or acrylics, they'll colour the whole canvas or whole piece of paper first, or with a burnt sienna or burnt umber, something like that. Don't know why my computer's making that strange noise. Anyway, please ignore that strange noise. My computer's got a mind of its own apparently today. So yeah, so I just want to get over that white space that's sort of staring up at me, and by that I just want to map out the scales. They're not really scales, they're just how the skin is, and just build up the layers from a base coat to a more defined, detailed layer. So here I've done one scale, miss one scale, miss one scale, going around this area. Now if you were to do two against each other, you might as well do the whole thing, because the two that are touching each other, because they're wet, will run into each other. With these videos it's really hard, because I don't know yet, because I've not been doing this for I've been teaching for over 20 years, I guess, but when it's video I don't know how much the viewers understand, or if they're complete beginners. If you're more experienced, then I apologise if my explanations are a little bit too basic, but I just want to make these open, sort of tutorials open to everybody, so you can see what techniques I'm using and then take them and use the same techniques on your projects. So this area I've wet it just with the water, and now I'm just dripping little bits of pigment in and letting them do their own thing. It's always interesting to try different techniques, and another thing I'd like to mention is with wet mediums, water-based mediums, or even oils really, I do like to swatch them out, because they do look different wet to when dry, and obviously with a water-soluble medium they are going to look different with how much water is added, so how dilute they are. So straight off the pencil, dry, looks very, very different to straight off the pencil with a little bit of water added. So they dry a different colour, different hue to, and a different tone to when they're wet. So we've worked around quite an area now, just the same thing, leaving a little bit of space. I think at this point it looks quite nice like this for a different style, quite stylised. It looks almost batik in style. Then on with some pencil work. Now with the pencil work, once you've got a base coat layer down like this, you could either leave it, and obviously it'd be quite stylised looking, whatever you decided to do. You could do flowers like this and they'd look like batik flowers. So you could leave it, or you could, we know now that because we work wet in wet and wet on dry, that all that pigment is permanent. So now you could go on with more wet on wet. So you can add water now to these areas and drop more colour in, because the colour underneath won't shift. So you could work it like that, or like this. You could add the dry pencil mediums. You could even take one of the blocks and use that dry. You know, you don't have to add water to the blocks. If the blocks are all you have, you could actually take the block and rub that on the paper too. But just as I said with the pencils earlier on, if you do scribble on the paper with a block and then add water, not all the pigment activates each time. So just be mindful. Always best to try on a spare piece of paper before trying anything on your project. So here, back on with some more pencil. These are all the Inktense pencils. Now I could either leave that dry, just leave it alone and say that's done, it's picked up the texture of the paper and I like that, I'll leave it, or get the colour on there excuse me, and then add water. And you can go, the beauty of this medium is you can go backwards and forwards between the blocks, the pencils, dry or wet. It's a phenomenal medium, it really is. And I've heard a lot of people sort of not getting on very well with it, and I don't know what they were expecting from this medium, but I love it. After the first initial sort of 15 minutes of playing with this medium, when I first got the blocks and the pencils, finding out what they could do, what they couldn't do, what they were like and what they weren't like, you know, comparing them to other mediums. Once you're over that sort of 15-minute learning curve, it's wonderful. They are absolutely gorgeous, and I thoroughly recommend them to anybody who wants to give them a go. Now this is white, and all I'm doing, I've wet my brush and I'm lifting the white off the white block, not off the white pencil, off the white block. The white block seems to be more opaque when applied as opposed to the white pencil. So wherever there's white highlights, they've been applied using the white block and not the white pencil. Just something to keep in mind. However, the white pencil is great. If I laid down some green pencil and I wanted to lighten it, applying white pencil and then applying water would lighten that for me without bleaching it out, if you know what I mean, without making it too white and opaque. Some of the colours are more opaque than others, and that's really why it's always best to swatch out your colours as well. So as you saw me applying, it was a dark blue pencil between some of the scales. I've applied that over the majority of this part of the head now. Now what I decided was to apply water to some areas, so to activate some areas of that dark blue pencil, and to leave other areas unactivated, so to leave them dry. And that's the best thing about doing something like this. You could do a bird with the feathers and activate colours in some areas and not others, or flowers, or an autumn leaf, you know, anything. Just, you know, that it's a fabulous medium, and I will be doing more with the Inktense. Very easy to use, not too expensive. Somebody asked me about using the Winsor & Newton artist inks that you buy in the little bottles. They're great too. They dry permanently, they dry matte, very flat, great to photograph, great to make prints from. But I don't want to be carrying around sort of 15 or 20 little bottles of ink. You know, I'm just, I just wouldn't trust myself. If I wanted to go and sketch somewhere, you know, plein air, I don't want to be carrying, bottles of ink around. I'd much prefer to just put this dry medium, the dry pencils, the dry blocks into my art bag, take them with me, and with a, you know, a brush pen, sorry, you know, a little brush that's filled with water. Much easier. Okay, so the reason I didn't film the eye is because I hadn't really made this drawing as big as I should have done to get the detail in, so I leant right over it, and whilst leaning right over it, I forgot to switch my camera on. So, but the eye was just done exactly the same, built up in very, very light layers until I got the intensity of colour that I wanted. It was worked wet in wet to begin with, like this area is being worked, and then on with the dry pencils, and then activated with a tiny drop of water using this brush. And really it's just rinse and repeat, keeping my eye on the reference image and working from light to dark predominantly. But with these Inktense, you can actually work light over dark as well, because you've got the beautiful opacity of some of the colours. And yeah, please do swatch your paints, because sometimes it's quite surprising. To do a little swatch, all you need to draw is use a Sharpie or something like that, that isn't going to bleed when water's placed on it. Draw a rectangle for each colour. So if you've got 12 colours that you want to swatch, then draw 12 little rectangles. Draw a line through each rectangle, so splitting the rectangle into a third and 2/3, or you could put 2 lines and have just 3/3, and then apply your swatch going from, say, left to right, going from 100% pigment to really watered down on the right, so you get a gradient. And then watching how well it covers that black line you have running through at 1/3 will show you the opacity of the paint. And you can also, if it's not too opaque, you can also pop another wash on if at a later date to see if it would be more opaque with 2 layers. See how well it covers up that black line that's running through the 1/3. If you want me to do a video about making swatches, then please leave comments in the comments below, and I'll happily see to that. Also, thank you so much for everybody that's hitting like. That's wonderful. Please hit like, if it really does help me as a channel. And if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe, because that helps my channel too. And thank you to the amazing people who have not only liked my videos, subscribed to my channel, but are sharing my videos as well. Sharing with family and friends, or art groups, or people you think might be interested in listening to my waffling process and watching my projects. It really helps me, and so appreciative that hopefully I'll be able to do more of these videos for you in the future. So I spoke earlier about having to freehand drawing in, and as you can see, the little scales underneath his throat are all drawn in. I mean, really, I could have just sat and done the whole skin running right the way down, but I got bored, so I thought, oh my word, I'll just have to do a few, then do a bit of painting, then draw in a few more, and then do a bit more painting, draw in a few more, do a bit more painting, do it that way, break it up a bit. I shouldn't say I was bored, because I wasn't really, but it can become a little bit tedious. That's the word, I think. Nothing's boring when it's art, but some things can become a little bit tedious. So I'd got podcasts on, I got plenty of coffee on the go, so lovely. So, and just dropping in random colours. So don't want to make this too uniform, because it wasn't in the photographs that I'd got. And this isn't a complete like for like. When you're using a reference photograph, it is a reference, you know, you're not creating, or I'm not, you're not creating an identical match, I guess. A mirror image. Oh no, because that'd be reversed, wouldn't it? A mirror image. But you know what I mean? It's, you know, I'm not trying to create this iguana's identical twin. I'm simply using the reference image as a reference, and then some things I'll stick quite closely to the reference, like proportions, composition, things like that. Colours to a certain extent, but other things I'll rely on my own judgment as an artist. Yeah, artistic license can go a long way. Can alter things that I don't like. You know, people will say, why copy from a reference photo? Why not just put the reference photo in a frame and hang it on your wall? And that, I think my reply is because I want to make it better. I'm no David Bailey when it comes to photography. I've got a really good camera, Canon. I've got really good lenses, but no photographs I take would I be happy with those on my wall. And for me, taking photographs of the references I want to paint and draw is all part of the artistic process. So I like to take a lot of photos, and then I like to combine 2, 3, 5 photos sometimes to create a pleasing composition, what I feel is pleasing to my eye and hopefully the viewers of the finished artwork. Just drying that off with a hairdryer there, so I can work wet into wet on top without disturbing that colour. Yeah, so I like to work from different photographs to make a pleasing to the eye composition. So I will stick quite firmly to a composition once I've got one sort of sketched out from my photographs. Yeah, I don't know what I was saying now. That was a complete waffle. But yeah, artistic license. And then colours can vary slightly. Details, sometimes, I mean, they're not always going to be spot on. I won't say, right, in this part of the skin there's 104 scale-like details, so I need to do 104 scale-like details in this certain area. I'm not that, I'm not a stippler for that much detail. Well, I am with the detail, but not sticking to the photograph, if you know what I mean. It needs to look realistic, it needs to be plausible. As you can see, I sat and I sketched all of those out, and yeah, it does its job. It did its job. It now gives me guidelines. I didn't want to go and just dot paint here, there and try and make it up as I go, because there is actually a pattern running through this piece of skin, and I needed to get that pattern in before applying any paint. So I did my wet in wet washes to begin with, as you saw, dried it all off with a hairdryer, then turned the board round and worked it with it upside down to get the drawing in. And the reason I turned it upside down to get the drawing in, and you'll see quite a few people sketching things upside down, it makes it more abstract. It makes things easier to sketch by sketching upside down. So when I turned this round and I sketched all that detailing upside down, I was sketching abstract designs. My brain wasn't shouting at me, oh, hold up, you're sketching iguana skin. You know, to me it wasn't. It was just an abstract and very easy to do. So if you have any difficulties sketching anything, whether it be a dog or a tree or a flower, try turning your, apart from tracing, try turning your image upside down. Turn your drawing paper upside down and then sketching it upside down, because all of a sudden your brain won't be trying to tell you what an ear looks like or what a face looks like or what a certain flower looks like. It'll be looking for shapes, hopefully in an abstract design, and that is much easier to see and much easier to reproduce. If you want me to create any videos on sketching and different methods of sketching, then let me know in the comments below. I'll happily do that. I do have one video of how I sketch and sketching out a squirrel. I also have digital video of me sketching a camel head digitally. Whether I'm sketching digitally or traditionally, my methods are exactly the same. I look for the basic overall shapes first and then work the detail into the shapes. And the more you do, like anything, the easier it gets. With tracing, if you really are struggling with freehanding, then get yourself a little picture of something that's copyright free. So you could go on pixabay.com or unsplash.com. They've got thousands and thousands of photographs on there. Choose a photo of a subject you like, print it out, and then trace it multiple times, and then try freehanding it. And you'll find by having traced it multiple times, you'll have already found where all the details are, where the overall shapes are, and they'll be easier to reproduce in a freehand sketch. Okay, so I just added, I think, about 5 or 7 layers on the skin hanging from the underneath of the neck. It's like a wattle, but it's not called a wattle. Can't remember the name of it now. But yeah, that was a lot of work. It took a long time. Right, I'm just reaching down onto the floor for my notes that have fell on the floor. Bear with me. Okay. Oh, computer makes a sound again. Strange. Okay, so yeah, I was hoping. Oh, sorry about that. I was hoping to get this done a little bit quicker than. Oh, I don't know why that's doing that. And it stopped. Okay, I was hoping to get this project done and uploaded for the following week, so I was having a video go out each week. But Easter caught up with me, and I was just busy over Easter with family things. And then this all happened in quite quick concession. That's not the right word. Succession. I think that's the word. Yeah. I had 2 commissions come in, one straight after another from 2 different clients. One client already wants another commission, even though the first commission of his hasn't been done yet. It's only been sketched out. So busy on the commission front. I'm not complaining, by the way. And then I was contacted by 3 different art material manufacturers. Well-known ones, completely out of the blue, asking me to sample and review various products. So that's been happening as well. And then I've also been contacted by a gentleman from overseas who I've known for quite a while, but he contacted me sort of out of the blue and wanting to know if I'd be interested in illustrating a book. So it all sounds great when you write it down on paper, but yeah, so it's just been quite time consuming getting things sorted and off the ground. The book's not 100% yet. That's he's in talks with his client at the moment, and he was just trying to get a feel for things and making sure I was interested in doing this venture if it comes to pass. So there'll be more news on that soon, hopefully. But yes, I've been really busy this end, and trying to get this complete was very time consuming, but obviously enjoyable too. And then I had the video editing, which I did yesterday for this one. And funnily enough, while I was editing the video, my computer was as silent as a mouse. I don't know why it keeps making strange sounds today. But hopefully the audio is good with the mic. So lots of wet work, and it really is a rinse and repeat. Would you start getting familiar with this medium? It is just a breeze to work with. There's, as far as I'm concerned, there are no negatives. As you can see, you can mix up quite a thick mixture, a lot of pigment and little water, making sure that all the pigment is activated, and then applying it. And it really felt I was like applying like enamel. It was just went on so beautifully. And this isn't the blocks, this is wetting the pencil, so taking the pigment straight off the pencil to do this. So with a damp brush, and then picking the pigment off the end of the pencil, and just applies so beautifully. And you can see the beauty of this brush as well. It just holds so much water, so much pigment. You know, people think to get a lot of detail in you need a tiny brush with tiny bristles, and you see people using brushes with sort of a 000, and they've got like, you know, 3 bristles that are like millimeters long, and they're trying to do all the detail with that. Well, the thing is, with a small brush like that, it can't hold very much water, which means it can't hold very much pigment, which means you continually having to dip your brush back into your paint source, whether that be, you know, taking the pigment off a pencil like this, or taking the paint out of a palette. Whereas this brush does it all. Okay, so just working some darks in now. And as you can see, the brush is damp, and literally just taking it straight off the pencil, straight onto the paper. And I know, because of the amount of water I've got in my brush, that the paint I'm laying down now, all the pigment is activated. You know, there's enough water in that brush to activate the pigment as it goes down onto the paper. So I've no fears about, when this is dry, putting water back over that area I should say. And none of it will lift, none of it will reactivate, because all the pigment has been activated already. If in doubt with any mediums, when you're doing your swatch sheet, have another piece of paper next to you and just try things out, just experiment. And you know, the only wasted art material is the art material that's never used. So never think your art materials are that precious. I know some of the art materials are expensive, and I truly understand that. I'm in a fortunate place where a lot of companies provide me with art materials, but I do, you know, I thoroughly understand that some art materials are really expensive. And yeah, in the past I've saved up for art materials and bought them, so I do understand that. But the thing is, if we don't use them, if they just sit in a box looking pretty, then they're wasted. And you never get the joy that you initially wanted to get out of them. You know, you see beautiful paints and beautiful pencils, and you know, you dream of owning them. The thing is, you dream of owning them and using them, and from beautiful pencils make beautiful artworks. So if you are going to spend money on artwork, on art materials, then, you know, use them. So here I'm showing you going straight on with a block. So this is the damp brush straight onto the block, and this white block, there you go, it's really opaque. So, and you can mix that with a colour. So say I'd gone too dark somewhere, say I'd gone on with green somewhere that was too dark a green, and I wanted it to be a lighter green. Well, I wouldn't want to apply white like this really, although I could, because you could then wait for that to dry, or dry it with a hairdryer and then glaze the required green over the top. What I could do, so I could do it that way, but what I could also do is take the white, take the original green pigment that went down too, you know, too heavy, and mix up in the well of my palette a lighter green and apply that, because it's opaque, because you've added the white and it'll cover over the darker green. And there you have him, Iguana in Derwent Inktense. Any questions, pop them in the comments below. I do respond to everybody. Thanks so much for joining me today. And if you've made it this far, wow, you've listened to 40 minutes of waffle, so thank you. Hi there my friends, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm working Inktense, and the subject is a toucan. I'll be using the Inktense, they're by Derwent, so the Derwent Inktense blocks, as you can see here, and Derwent Inktense pencils. This was a bit of an experiment to begin with, as I wanted to run the Inktense pigments through my airbrush. So you can see me there, I've put a little bit of distilled water into the airbrush, and I'm just adding pigment straight from the block. So for all of the background, that's what I did. I just mixed up different colours from the Inktense blocks that you can see before you and ran them through the airbrush, and I was really pleased with the results. Worked really well. The Inktense blocks at the moment are available in 72 colours, and the Inktense pencils, also by Derwent, are available in 100 set now. You can see more work with Inktense pencils and blocks on my channel if you want to have a look. Okay, so I'm working on Saunders Waterford hot press watercolour paper at £140 in weight. I've pre-stretched it and also stapled it to a board, popped some framers tape round the acid free, masked out the branch, masked out the toucan and the plant with a frisket material, and yes, set to working up some layers on the background. If you'd like me to make a video just airbrushing and how I go about airbrushing backgrounds and details and things, then pop it in the comments below and I'll be more than happy to do an airbrushing video. So just building up the layers. I hope everyone's keeping well, as I am. The new studio's coming along really well. The electrics are about to go in. The plastering's going to be done after that. Then I'll be painting, putting some new flooring down, and then moving the furniture all back in. And then, huge sigh of relief, I'll be in the new studio. So as you can see, back to the painting, just building up the layers from light to dark at the moment, making it very random because I want it to be all out of focus in the background. I've popped the finish painting at the top left hand corner so you can see where I'm going with the painting and what I'm aiming for. So I've got all of this in mind. It's nothing like the reference I was working from. It's just something that I wanted to do and have a play with my materials. So let's have a look, see where we're up to now. So the trouble is when you're videoing like this, it can distort slightly and it looks like I'm using the airbrush at an angle, but in actually, well, it is an angle, but it's 90-degree angle and it's not too close to the paper. The airbrush I'm using is an Iiguana. I've got a couple of airbrushes, an old Badger one that I still use from time to time. I have had to replace the compressor recently, as I'd had the original compressor for about 25 years, 26 years. So I've replaced like for like now. It was still working, but it was very clunky. It had gone very noisy. So I'll pop the compressor description in with this description, in with the video description, so you can take a look. But it's not the most portable of compressors, but they're fantastic. They keep a nice steady pressure. I never had problems with the old one, and now the good one, the new one is it's brilliant. Love these compressors. But I'll put all the details in the description of all the materials I'm using. So just skip forward now. The background's done. I did go in with a little bit of purple in the background, different shades of green, and some blues and a little bit of white as well. Just to keep it all out of focus, I used quite a lot of cool colours just to push the background further back from the subject. So now I'll be working with a mixture now of the blocks, the Inktense blocks and the Inktense pencils, and I'll be using a variety of brushes as well. Anything that just comes to hand I'm just picking up and using. I didn't know whether this was going to be an experiment that worked or an experiment that didn't. We'll get those. But this actually, the background went on so nicely that I thought, no, this is what I'm going to go and carry on with and complete this painting. Because actual painting the subject is something that I've done a lot of with Inktense. I love this medium. For those of you who haven't come across Inktense before, it's just a water-soluble ink. and it's permanent when it's dry. So it can work a little bit like a watercolour, but just to keep in mind that it is permanent. So it's very, very hard to lift. You can lift a little bit if you work quite quickly, but once it's dry, it's permanent. Wonderful medium by Derwent. I'm not getting paid to say any of this. I am a Derwent ambassador, and these materials were sent to me by Derwent, but apart from that, it's all my own views, and I always tell you the truth. If I like something, I like it. If I don't like it, and I'll tell you why. Okay, so I'm working from the blocks at the moment. I'm just using a little bit of distilled water to take the pigment off the block. If there's not a colour I want, then I'll mix colours on a palette, because these blend and mix so well together. You can come up with a whole variety of colours. I mean, it's never ending the amount of colours you can get from the Inktense. Drying it off with a hairdryer, that really makes it permanent really quickly, so that can layer up on top. Testing that it's dry. This is going to be a long video, by the way. It's about 55 minutes, I think. So turning the board on its side. This is why I don't tape my work directly to a permanent surfaces, because I like to rotate the board as I'm working. For those of you who've followed me for a while and know me, I did have problems with my shoulder. The rotator cuff muscles in my shoulder played up a few years ago. I don't want that issue back, so I make painting as comfortable for myself as I can, and that means rotating the board, getting my work at a nice angle where I feel comfortable working. So it's all about layering. With all of my mediums, I'm self-taught, and I just like building up layers. So I could have gone in with a very dark pigment to begin with, but it doesn't give the effect that I like. I like to build up layers. It gives a nice depth to the work, so the light can go through the layers and bounce about. I think it's called refracting, and as the light refracts through the layers, you just get a sense of depth in your colour. So these Inktense blocks and Inktense pencils, they can look quite dull in the dry pigment form, but once you add water to them, they really pop. The colours are absolutely amazing. And with most of my water-soluble mediums, I do like to swatch them out, so I've got something to refer to as I'm working. So a little bit of a colour reference going on. Going on with water there to begin with, distilled water, and then popping the pigment on and letting it do its thing. I am working upright. When I'm working with Inktense, I very rarely work with my work flat on a table. I'm just comfortable either standing or sitting at the easel working upright, and that's what I'm doing here. Just going on with layers, building it all up. Hope everyone's keeping really well. I can't believe we're sort of heading towards the end of May 2023. This year's flown by. Okay, so going in with a pencil there, with one of the Inktense pencils, getting a little bit of detail in, and I will come back and dissolve the pigment, well, activate the pigment. Some people finding that their pigments aren't activating, and then when they go on with the next layer, they are activating and muddying up the following colour. And I think the thing is, you really need to make sure that when you lay a layer down, that you do activate all of the pigment. Make sure that you're adding enough water to get all of that pigment activated before you add your next layer. Because the thing is, if you put a layer down, especially a dry layer as I'm doing now, if you only activate a little bit of it, then dry it off, when you do go to put your next layer on and then add water, the layer underneath will activate and the colours will mix, which is great if that's what you wanted to do. But if you don't want it to contaminate the following layer, you do need to make sure you've added enough layer so each particle has been dissolved and has been allowed to dry and settle into the paper. That way you can carry on layering, layering, layering and glazing. I do love this medium for glazing, because the amount of layers you can glaze is just endless. They're beautiful, they're vibrant, beautiful and permanent, which is ticks all my boxes. So just moving the board slightly so I can get in. And this is one of my favourite brushes. It's by Rosemary & Co. It's a round, but the tip on it is phenomenal. I've got a couple of them and they just do a wonderful job. So when using Inktense, you can use watercolour brushes, you can use brushes that are meant for gouache, however you want to pronounce it. You can use brushes, that are meant for acrylic. It'll work with all of those and it won't damage any of your brushes. And because it's water based, you simply just wash your brushes out underneath a tap and you're done. You can use Inktense on paper, canvas, board, wood, fabric even, and as long as you dry it all off, it's all permanent. So building up the layers, gone quite dark now. So you could look at the underneath of a toucan's bill and think, it just looks black. But if you just apply black, it'll look very flat. So what I like to do, I like to build up with purples and blues and really get some intense colours. Don't mix the word intense up with Inktense. But yeah, build up some intense colours underneath and gradually build up to a nice darker colour. You can pop a little black in then if you like when you put your darks in, but it just lets all of those colours shine through, gives an added sense of depth to colour. And I'm not pressing on at all, and that's something I think with a lot of videos on YouTube, you can't see how people are using the material. You can see to a certain extent, but you don't know how much pressure is being applied, and really no pressure is being applied at all. I'm just letting the tooth of the paper, this is hot press paper, but obviously it's still got some tooth. Just letting the tooth of the paper catch the pigment, and that way I'm not applying too much pigment all at once. As I said, if you're really quick, you can dab it back off with tissue. I've got a tissue in the other hand, obviously, to wipe the brush on, and obviously if I get too much wet pigment on an area, I can quickly dab it off before it dries. You can go over it. The white block is more opaque than the white pencil, so if you did need to go over an area and crisp some lighter areas up, then the block is the one that I'd use as opposed to the pencil. You might need a few more layers to make it completely opaque, especially if you're covering either a graphite line or some darker area that had been applied and you didn't really want it as dark. Then a few layers of the white, wet the pigment, let it settle, dry it off with a hairdryer, and then you can put whatever colour over the top that you'd like, because you can glaze. Going in with some different colours and different tones. Colour isn't as important as people think, as long as you're realistic. I mean, if the bird is sitting under different lighting conditions, it's going to look different anyway. But it's all about contrast, and this beautiful toucan, these, the different species of toucan, they all have quite a lot of contrast, and it's contrast that makes it pop. So all contrast is the difference between the lightest area of a painting and the darkest area of a painting. Now, I don't know if you noticed that, but in the last frame, I had got a pupil in the eye and now I haven't. And that just shows you how opaque the white block is. I didn't like how the eye was going, so I wanted to block it back out and start again. So what I did, I mixed up quite a thick mixture from the white Inktense block, painted it over the eye, dried it off with a hairdryer. I think I did that a couple of times until it was solid white, then applied a yellow wash, and the eye that was underneath completely gone, and I can start again. So going on with the pencils now, just building up a little bit of texture. At some point, I think I do hold up and show you how many pencils I'm using. I can't remember now. And just building up some details in there with the pencils. And then I'll go in, activate it with distilled water on a brush. Wait for it to dry. There you go, going in with a brush. And that's a filbert brush. That's a really cheap brush, actually. I think they're by Royal Langnickel. They're called Crafter's Choice or something, but it's a golden tack-on bristle, and they're quite firm and they work fantastically. They really do. So I do have some expensive brushes that I save predominantly for fine watercolour work, but when you're using things like Inktense, I just reach for whatever works. So as you can see there, I've worked the eye in, and now I'm just going in and popping some detail in. Now another thing you can do, you can work wet onto dry, obviously, wet onto wet, and wet onto just damp, which I believe is what I'm doing here. The paper, I've put a wash on, activated the blues and purples and pinks underneath, and before the paper is completely dry, and you've got to make sure that you don't really want to add anything over the top of this in case it ruffles the surface of the paper, but just applying a little bit of pigment on top and letting it settle into the just damp paper. So the paper isn't wet, but it's not completely dry when I add the white highlights, and it just makes the pencil apply a little bit easier. The pencils are very blendable. If something goes on with a dry pencil and I like it, I leave it. You don't have to activate anything, as long as you know that's going to be your final layer. Obviously you won't be able to glaze over it because it's not already been activated, and as I said earlier, it will carry on reacting until all the pigment has been dissolved. I should say activated really instead of dissolved, but you know what I mean. Any questions, leave them in the comments below, and if you're enjoying this video, please just hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. It does help the algorithms, and yes, share with your friends and family if you'd like. Anybody that would be interested, please give them the nod over to my channel. I work with pastels and watercolours, acrylics, oils, a little bit of digital, so a bit of a mixture for everything on here. And I will be working on a lot of bigger projects once I'm in the new studio. I can't wait. It's been 8 months and it's like, oh my word, it's like having a pregnancy, and just wanting everything to go by really quickly. So building in the darks now. So I know that the patch around the toucan's eye is red, but I didn't want to go on with a flat red because again it would look flat, and got to remember that some of the feathers hanging over that pink skin area are going to create a shadow, so I needed to add that as well. Building up the highlights and turning around so you get a better view. Again, I'm turning the board just to make it more comfortable, so I'm not leaning across the work or getting my arm in a particular position that it doesn't like. And sometimes if you can't see, if you know there's something not quite clicking with a painting or a drawing that you're doing, but you can't quite put your finger on something that you feel is wrong, just pop your painting upside down and have a look, or take a photograph on your phone and have a look that way, or look at it in a mirror. So look at a reversed image and it should sort of jump out at you what's wrong. And if in doubt, ask somebody on an art group or here on YouTube, and just ask them if they can have a quick look for you. 9 times out of 10 it's something simple. If you know there's something wrong with a painting, it's really easy to find out what's wrong. So check your colour balance, check your contrast, and see if it's one of those. If it's proportional, then that needed to be picked up right at the very beginning when you're doing your initial sketches. So for this one, I sketched out the toucan on a separate piece of paper, did a few thumbnails. That's just a little sketch for finding what sort of composition I'd like. Do that all on a separate piece of paper. Then once I was happy with my sketch lines, I traced them, transferred them over onto this piece of watercolour paper, and that means I've got this solid drawing to work from. What you don't want to do is sketch out your initial lines and think, oh, it'll do for now, I'll correct, proportions and things as I go along. that's really hard to do, because once you start adding colour, especially with something like this, it's really difficult. If you've got the eye in the wrong place, really, you know, that needed to be sorted out right at the very beginning. And if that happened to me, I wouldn't go any further, I wouldn't progress with the painting, I would actually start again, because things proportional wise are really hard to adjust the further you get into a painting, especially if it's something like this. If it's acrylics, you can shift proportions slightly, as with oils you can as well, but when it's something where there's going to be fine detail going in, yeah, you're better off starting again. So make sure when you do start a painting that the groundwork is done beforehand and you've got a nice well organised sketch to begin with. Make sure your proportions and things are right, and don't go right up to the edges of a piece of paper. I've seen a few people do paintings and they're absolutely fantastic, but they've taken the painting or drawing right up to the edge of the paper. Now that means if you want to mount it and frame it, you're going to be losing some of your painting in the process. So make sure you leave, you know, half an inch around the edge, just so that when you mat it and, you know, when you put a mount round it or over it and frame it, you're not losing any of your painting. So going in with details again, so I went in with a white and now I'm going in with this indigo colour, just filling in some of the gaps, giving it a sense of depth and a sense of, yeah, depth between the feathers, just so the highlighted feathers do actually look like they're sitting proud to the dark feathers surrounding them. Down to some of the feathers on the legs now. Just getting the base colours in, and I'm working just dry on dry, so it's just dry pencil on dry paper for this. The colours are very interchangeable, interminglable. Oh, I've just made up a word. They're blendable, sorry. So yeah, having that swatch sheet next to you with all of the colours already swatched out is perfect. You can refer to it going through the process, knowing you're not going to pick up an incorrect colour. If you do happen to pick up and apply a colour in any style of painting, and it's not the colour you thought it was going to be, instead of leaving it and it just looking quite out of place, what I would do personally is apply that colour just in a small amount elsewhere, a couple of other places in a painting. That way it looks like it's meant to be there, and then it doesn't look like it's a mistake. Just, you know, personal experience there. So I've added water, and now I'm going over to the other side, and I'm going to just darken that a little bit, giving a little bit of shadow where the other feathers would be overlapping that part of the leg. And going on dry at the minute. So the pigments underneath the pencil have already been activated. They've already been dissolved into the rest of the painting, and now I'm just adding dry on dry. So I've cut out all the clips, so when you see me go backwards and forwards between areas, that they've already been hair dried. So I've got put one of these little fold away travel hair dryers, and I just pop that over, give it a quick blast of the hair dryer. It doesn't damage the paper or anything like that, and it just means I can keep going from one portion of the painting to another, knowing that the portion I'm going to has been dried off and is ready to be reworked. And obviously, as I said earlier, if I apply dry pigment and I like the look of it just as it is, and I know that's going to be the final layer on that area, then I'll just leave it as dry pigment. I don't feel the need to activate it. Just because it's a water soluble medium doesn't mean it's always got to be activated with water. If I want to leave it as just dry pigment and I like the look of it, that's what I'll do. Same with watercolour pencils, that's how I'll use those as well. Just because they are water soluble doesn't mean you have to, you know, use water with them all the time. You can see that actually shows really well the difference between the dry pigment and when it's activated with water. Really makes it pop. The vibrancy is wonderful. And the point on that brush is brilliant. As I said, I will list all the, I was going to say ingredients then. I'll list all the products in the description. Oh my word, using the word ingredients made me sound like I enjoy cooking. I don't. Oh, these brushes are wonderful though, by Rosemary & Co. It's a British company. The brushes are beautiful. And a bit of a pause there. Oh, in with a hairdryer, there you go. And that piece of paper that was wafting around to the right hand side, that was a piece of glassine. And I buy glassine by Clairefontaine. And all it is, I think it used to be called butcher's paper. And it's like semi-transparent paper, and it doesn't pick up anything. So you can lay it across a piece of work and then rest your hand on it, and it doesn't smudge or interfere with the work that's underneath. That's why it's just there. I've been leaning my hand on it so as not to put any human oils as such from my hand onto the paper, and not to damage the work I've already done that's underneath. And it is acid free, so it is artist friendly. Clairefontaine is an artist company anyway, manufacturer of art materials anyway. So darkening the shadows a little bit more. And just keep referring to my reference image at this point, making sure the shadowed areas are going in the right direction. And on the reference image, I couldn't see any detail as such in these areas. I know it's all feathers, and I'm still using the materials in the direction that the feathers would be laying, but there was no individual detail available on the image, and I wasn't going to start making it up because this area on the overall painting is very small, and in life you wouldn't be able to see every single feather at this sort of distance from the bird anyway. The bird's probably a bit bigger than I've actually depicted it in the painting itself, so it's probably not life size. I've not really had a look to see how tall these birds are, or how long they are from beak to tail tip. And always remember that the general viewing distance for a painting is 2.5 times the diagonal. So that's typically, it's really weird actually, but it's typically how far a person will be standing away from a painting to view it is 2.5 times the diagonal. So if you can't see detail at 2.5 times the diagonal, generally it's not needed, and you're just putting in detail that's not really going to be viewed anyway, unless you're like me and a bit of a detail freak. But I do like to get close up to people's paintings and see brushwork and, you know, tiny details, but that's just me. That's not generally, if it's hung on your wall, you're not going to be standing that close to a painting anyway. And always remember that when you're working from reference image, it's just your way of depicting what's in a reference image. You're never going to have the finished painting hanging alongside the reference image, so don't worry if things aren't exact, unless it's pet portrait, or you know, you're doing commission work for somebody. Then you need to be on spot with detail and colour and things like that. But when it's something like this, it's my interpretation of the reference image, that's all. And as long as I'm happy with the painting, that's all that matters really, isn't it? So it's our journey. Everybody's artistic journey is their own, so own it and enjoy it, and don't let anybody put you off. If you're creating art, you know, and you're enjoying it, do it. And if you feel you need help, then ask. Yeah. Okay, so going on to this large chest area. That's looking a little bit green, but it was a little bit more lemony colour. I don't tend to remember the names of the colours of the Inktense blocks and pencils. I just pick up whatever seems right at the time. So using one of these Crafter's Choice Royal and Langnickel brushes again, Filbert, and just working wet into wet from one of the blocks. So this is from pigment from one of the Inktense blocks. So you can pick it straight up from the block, or you can pop a little bit of water into a palette and drop in some of the pigment and do it that way. Dried it off with a hairdryer, going over it with water. So I'm going to be working wet on wet again, and obviously the pigment underneath, because it's permanent, isn't moving, and starting to add sorry, some reds, and obviously because it's transparent or translucent, that red is mixing optically with the yellow underneath and creating this lovely orange. Just what I wanted. If in doubt, try it on a piece of scrap paper first before applying any new techniques or colours to your painting. That goes with anything really. I always have a scrap piece of paper next to me just to try out different colours, different mixes before applying it if I'm unsure to the painting or project that I'm working on at the moment. And if you're working with a piece of scrap paper next to your painting, it's generally a good idea to have the like for like. So if you're working on, say, Saunders Waterford hot press paper, it will have a certain texture, it will have a certain whiteness, a certain colour to the white, and then you want to be trialing your new techniques and colours out on something that is the same as. And obviously if I wanted to put green over that yellow, then I'd need to have already applied a little bit of that yellow to the scrap piece of paper to try all the green over the top. It's just things like that. Different brands of paper have different whitenesses about them. Some of them are more on the cream range, some of them are really, really bright white, and there's no point in testing a colour out on a creamy coloured paper and expecting it to look the same when applied to a piece of really bright white paper. You get the gist. And that also goes a little bit along the lines of when you're swatching colours. So if you're making a swatch chart of a certain material, try and swatch it out on paper that is similar to the paper you're going to be using to actually create projects in the future, just so it gives you a better idea of how the products are going to work for you. Some companies will provide pre-printed swatch charts for you to fill in by hand, and that's great, but sometimes that the paper that they use is meant to be printed on, and that might not react the same as a watercolour paper, for instance, that you're going to be using for your projects, just to keep that in mind. Okay, so building up some darks now. I've just put a tiny bit of dark in the chest, marked in an area where I know there's I was going to say foliage then, darker plumage. Oh my word, I've not had enough coffee today. It is only 10 o'clock in the morning though. I've already had 2, so I'll have another one after I've finished doing this voiceover. So just working dry on dry at the minute, just building up some different colours. Indigo was one of my favourite colours, and I always keep a couple of spares of that colour because I do like it a lot. Going in with a crimson colour here, excuse me, building up some reds and purples and lilacs in this area before activating it. And it's really cool excuse me, to use, because as you add the water, it pretty much sets where you've put it, so it doesn't sort of ruin it into any other area, because you've got to remember I'm working in an upright position. I've just applied a little bit of white there so that when I add the red on top, it doesn't go too dark. A little bit of yellow ochre colour going in there. So yeah, even though I'm working in an upright position, the colour, I don't add that much water that the colour's going to drip down the paper. I just add just enough, and it's, you know, it's a learning curve, trial and error. You'll end up knowing how much water to add that will just there'll be enough water to activate the pigment, but not enough water that it's going to dribble down your page. That's what I was getting to. So look at that. It's just, whew, it just still blows me away even watching this, how the colours are so different from being dry to being wet. It's just phenomenal. It really is. And that way, by doing the darks now, I can flick little marks up into the yellow area of the bird, and that's negative painting. So defining yellow feathers, or will be defining yellow feathers by painting the surround of each yellow feather, if that makes sense. That's called negative painting. So you can see how many colours were actually put in this area with dry pencil. Now they're all reactivating. You can see reds and lilacs, purples. There's some blue in there as well, I think. And coming round to this side where I did put some white down so the colour wouldn't go too dark. Oh, I love it. Absolutely love this medium. And little flicks of the brush up into the yellow just to show a breakage in the yellow plumage. Just going over that darker area that had popped in earlier. Yeah, it's a lovely medium to work with. This makes me want to do more and more and more. Obviously, I do work in all other mediums, so I have to be careful. I don't just do one medium all the time. I would get bored eventually, I think, if I just stuck to one medium. I just like to change it up a bit and do big projects and then small projects and then big projects and then small projects, and doing commissions along the way. I do have a commission still waiting to be started, so I need to get onto that after I've finished doing this voiceover today. And that was another wash. So that was just a wash that I'd mixed up in a palette and just applied straight to the paper instead of going on with a pencil first. Again, drying it off with a hairdryer so I can carry on working on top. Now that one looks like water on its own. So just some water, and that was a quick view of some wash that I'd mixed up. So, and going on. And the reason I added water first is obviously I don't want that red staining and making hard edges. So I needed to just make sure. If you get a hard edge, because it's permanent, it can be quite difficult to disguise it. So wet into wet, if you're unsure and working with a darker pigment, just go wet into wet, and then you won't have that problem of hard edges. Now working in the highlighted areas of the chest feathers, and I was just sanding off the pencil on a piece of sandpaper just to create a harsh edge on the pencil itself, so I could get some nice crisp lines going in. And it was, I can't say tedious because it wasn't, because I did enjoy it, but it did take a long time to build up the amount of highlights that I needed. I did quite a few layers like this, building up gradually, because what you can do is build up white. Oh, this is what I did. Build up white feathers, white highlights like this, and you've got to remember that this hasn't been activated because this is a dry pigment. Then I went on with a yellow wash, a very, very light yellow wash, and what it did, it glazed, it activated the white and it glazed the white, or tinted the white, and then I did that several times to build up the layers for the chest area. And as you can see, I'm going in between some of those lighter areas. If something doesn't look light enough or bright enough, 9 times out of 10 it's because the thing next to it isn't dark enough. And so by going between the two, building up your darks and your lights, your contrast, you'll get a nice balance. And it's just trial and error. It's experience and knowing about these things. And so just remember, if you've applied something that's you thought was really light, one, you can check it against the whiteness of your paper to see if you have actually gone light enough, and if not, if you put something dark next to it, it'll make the light thing look lighter, and vice versa as well. People could be really frightened about going too dark, when in actual fact most of the time people don't go dark enough with their darks, and it's not until you get something light next to it that you'll realise your darks need to go darker or your lights need to go lighter. Works both ways. So put in some extra colours in here, and I will go through and activate this with water later. Probably got fed up of doing that and moved down the bird a little bit. And you do, I never really stick to one area for a long time on a painting. I do like to flip between areas of painting, and it's to keep a balance in a painting as well. The more I do to a painting, the more you can look back at certain points in a painting and realise you need to freshen an area up, or take an area darker, or take an area lighter, and it just keeps that balance flowing through a painting as you're working. And also, yeah, stops you getting bored with one certain area. So building up a second layer, on this part of the painting. And I'm so pleased that my hair wasn't flicking in and out of frames. I think I've learnt my lesson now to keep my hair well and truly tied back during the painting process, so you don't have to put up with pieces of my hair floating in and out of the frame while I'm working. The colours are so intense, aren't they? They're lovely, they really are lovely. Yeah, the pencils are now available in 100 set, and I came home one afternoon to find that I'd had a delivery from Derwent, and they'd sent me the new tin of 100 pencils as a gift. It was just, it was lovely. So I swatched them out and then did a little video that's here on YouTube, just of the new 28 colours that makes up, took the collection from 72 colours to 100. I did a little red-eyed tree frog, and that's here on my YouTube channel if you'd like to take a look how I did that. So now I'm using that very thin brush, the round Rosemary and Connolly round brush, to activate the pigments that I've just put on and add a little bit of detail as well. You can see it being pulled up into the yellow, the orangey yellow area there. And obviously I'd done the same going down the bird as well, and brought out some feathering details very lightly. And whenever I'm painting fur or feathers or scales or anything like that, or veins on a leaf or anything like that, even in the base coat layers, I always go in the correct direction, so the direction which the feathers are growing, or the fur is growing, or the scales are laying, or the veins are on a leaf, so that if any of the underlying lines show through from the base coat layers to the finished layers, the top layers, they'll still look correct because they are going in the correct direction. So I've added some base coat layers to the underneath of the bird, and just popping in some more water now to apply extra washes. As you can see, I've added the detailing of the feathers now that are overlapping the bird's legs, and I did that again by doing a very thick white mixture with the block, like I did to cover up the eye that I didn't like and I wanted to do again. And then once it's wet, I can go wet into wet and carry on adding layers. Oh, it looks like I'd finished with that, and I dried it off anyway. Okay, so now I've gone back to the adding detail with the white, adding the highlights with the white, like I did on the yellowy orange area on the chest. Nice and steady. And as I said, I can leave these just as they are if I'm happy with the result, or I can go in between them and darken in between these highlighted feather texture, or I can tint them by adding a glaze over the top, and they won't shift. This is, yeah, it's just strange. Wherever you put the Inktense pencil, it's there. It doesn't shift to any other areas. When you wet it, when you activate the pigments, they literally stay where you've put them. It's amazing. Can't say there's no negatives about this material at all. I love it. Just love the Inktense. It's very addictive, and I think once you give it a go, you'll be pleasantly surprised. All of the Inktense materials are open. Oh, can't get words out. Are open stock, so you don't need to buy a full set if you don't want to. They're available in smaller sets. The pencils and the Inktense blocks are available in large sets, medium-sized sets, and small sets. I think the smallest sets are sets of 12, and they're open stock as well. So if you want to just buy a couple of pencils and a couple of blocks, you can do that, or just one pencil and give it a go. You know, choose a colour that you think you're going to like using. If you're into botanicals, there's lots of, you know, if you're into painting flowers, there's lots of pinks and reds and purples and lilacs and things. So it's just nice to pick a few colours and just give them a try, see if you're going to like them, and then, you know, take it from there. If you want to build your own set, a few colours each week or each month, you can do it that way. Or, you know, if you've got a special birthday coming up or Christmas, you know, well, quite a few months away yet, but yeah, who knows, you might want to start your Christmas list now and put a set on there. So I've started on the foot there, just building up some base coat layers. I don't want to draw your attention to the feet too much on a painting, so I think the bird has got enough of a wow factor without being drawn to feet. But as you saw there, you can go light to dark, dark to light. Just be aware that the opacity of these isn't great unless you're mixing in a lot of the white block with your colours, which will obviously lighten your colour but make it more opaque as well. Just building up a little bit of detail. And you can see there that how I masked the bird and the branch off right at the very beginning. I used torn paper to mask a rough idea of where the branch was going to go, and it's left a nice fuzzy line, out of focus line, for the edge of the branch. Because what I didn't want to do is have a really harsh stop and start line where I'd mask the branch out, because then I'd be really restricted to what I could actually put on the branch itself, and trying to disguise a real harsh line isn't the best, you know, thing to do. So I wanted a nice fuzzy out of focus edge so I could get some foliage, sort of out of focus lichen and mosses and things onto the branch, all made up. These aren't on the reference image at all, and it just made it that little bit easier. And then I applied numerous layers to the branch to get it to look how I wanted to look. So I applied dry mediums. This is all going on dry, just very random. I'd got podcast on, or music playing or something, so not really thinking about what I was doing, and using quite a mixture of natural colours, greens, tans, darker browns, some blues in there, but predominantly different greens, and just, yeah, did all these strokes random. I didn't want the eye to be drawn to anything in particular. I know the plant is on the branch that I ended up doing towards the end of the painting, but the branch itself is just something for the bird to perch on, so making it random. So just worked up lots and lots of layers. Oh, you can see that I've done the tail there as well, but that was just more of the same as I'd worked the rest of the bird. Building up some darks under there, and I did, yeah, several layers on the branch. I worked a lot of it all dry into dry to begin with. Then I activated it with one of the brushes, dried it off, Went on with the second coat, building up some more detail. Yeah, just keeping it nice and random. That's all I can say about that really. It's just I just kept the branch quite random so it'd look natural. I didn't want any patterns in there because it's very easy to get carried away and you look, you know, you sort of step back and look and you've all of a sudden created a pattern. So yeah, just keeping it nice and random. There's five pencils using. And then what you can't see with this is I was actually stippling water onto this area. So that's a brush made for acrylic paints, and I was just stippling. I wanted a stippling effect, and I achieved it just by getting a damp brush and just dabbing up and down instead of brushing backwards and forwards, because I didn't want any brush strokes showing up in this area. And I just found that that worked quite well. And then I dried it off with a hairdryer and went back over it backwards and forwards until I achieved a depth and a feeling of foliage that I liked. And I did use some of the colours that were in the background, that I'd used in the background. I used them in the branch, and I also used some of the colours from the background in the bird as well. Some of the blues that I'd used in the out of focus background at the very beginning of the video, I did utilise in the bird as well. I like to do that so it doesn't look like the bird is cut and paste onto the background. It just ties the background and the subject together when you share colours between the two. And layer 2 going on once everything was dry. Put in a little bit of a dark area around the foot, so just around the toes, just to give it a sense that there's something on there causing a little bit of a shadow. And obviously the underneath of the branch I made a little bit darker than the top of the branch, just so it looked like, you know, it was more a cylindrical shape. But obviously branches, you know, especially when they're covered with moss and lichen and plants, they're not even, there's no even lines, there's no straight lines. There's no straight lines in nature really, that we can see with the naked eye. Underneath the microscope you probably got, you know, a few straight lines in structures and things, molecular structures and things. But in nature, leave your ruler at home and just have fun with some natural lines, and obviously lines that are pleasing to the eye. You know, arcs and things like that appear in nature quite a lot. You know, the arc of the beak going from the point back up to the head is a lovely line, isn't it? That's pleasing to the eye. And going in with some dark still. It's very self-explanatory, isn't it, at this point? And we're getting to the end of the video, I think. So this was just worked dry onto dry, reactivated and done all over again quite a few times. Thank you if you've made it this far. There he is, all finished. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and come and join me on different social media platforms. I'd love it if you came over and said hi. Share with your friends. Thank you so much for sitting through the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something today. Stay safe, everybody. Until next time, bye for now.